It was, as the vicar's wife would later remark with a certain strained finality, a most disagreeable morning for a dead body to appear. The fog rolled over the hedgerows in damp fistfuls, and even the daffodils in the churchyard seemed to shrink from their own colour, as if ashamed to be blooming, when Miss Muriel Faversham lay so untidily at the foot of the vestry steps, her neck twisted at an angle more suited to marionettes than to humans. Lord Peter Wimsey had not been invited to much hollering. He had arrived instead, by way of a badly printed railway timetable, a recently discovered cache of 17th-century musical manuscripts in the village rectory, and a faint but nagging itch in his left shoulder that always suggested either atmospheric interference or impending intrigue. He disembarked with his customary elegance and a furled umbrella that he wielded like a conductor's baton. Though no orchestra had been summoned, much hollering, he had said, squinting up at the cracked enamel sign of the station, a name calculated to inspire confidence. One hopes the local poultry are not of a theatrical disposition. His arrival at the rectory was met with a mild flap of ecclesiastical astonishment, as the Reverend Osric Treadgold had long forgotten the letter he had sent Wimsey in December about the Purcell folios rumoured to be hiding in the attic archives. The Reverend was a long, loquacious sort with a fondness for metaphysical poetry and a wife who hovered over teapots like a sentry at the year. Some Wimsey had just settled into the study, having remarked upon the rectory clock's 5-second lag, the threadbare spot in the Aubusson rug, and the alarming slope of the bishop's portrait on the wall, when the housemaid flung open the door with more emotion than was strictly Anglican. "It's Miss Faversham. Sir, she's fallen, she's—" There was no need to complete the sentence. Mrs. Treadgold fainted with a soft thud against the tea-trolley, and the rector let out a strangled noise somewhere between a psalm and a hiccup. Wimsey rose at once, collected his hat, and stepped out into the mist. The vestry lay no more than 20 yards from the back of the rectory garden, a little Gothic appendage to the modest Norman bones of St. Cuthbert's Church. Its door was ajar, and the sound of drizzling water from the eaves gave the scene an unpleasantly surgical air. Miss Muriel Faversham had been the village's most respectable governess, a term still used without irony in much hollering, and resided in a tidy stone cottage with a climbing rose and a milk jug that always faced due east. She was, by all accounts, a woman of unimpeachable decorum, a tireless Sunday school organizer, and a reader of 19th-century novels in which fainting governesses were regularly rescued by melancholy baronets. Now she lay supine and unrescuable, her thin spectacles flung aside like punctuation, her hands folded in what might have been repose had not one finger been bent backward, most unnaturally. "Neck snapped," murmured Wimsey, kneeling briefly beside her. "But not from a fall, poor lady. If she tumbled, she did so with an unusual awareness of vertebral vulnerabilities." The village constable, a damp and solid young man named P.C. Weatherby, arrived 5 minutes later, puffing like an underfed bellows. "An accident, surely," he huffed. "She must have slipped." Wimsey stood, brushing moss from his trousers. But if you'll permit me a trivial observation, why is her left shoe damp and her right quite dry?" P.C. Weatherby blinked. "Maybe she stepped in something." "Quite," said Wimsey. "But the ground here is uniformly wet. She would logically be equally sodden on both sides. Yet the damp is patchy, suggestive of interruption, almost as though she walked across grass, stepped in water, then was carried back. One might even suspect staging. Staging, my lord. Not of the theatrical variety, alas. We may rule out an amateur performance of The Woman in White, though I must say, the lighting's appropriate. At this moment, the vicar stumbled into view, his collar askew, waving an envelope. "I say, Lord Peter, Miss Faversham had left this for me only yesterday. It's most singular. She said, and I quote, 'In the event of my demise, please give this to the proper authorities.' Rather a morbid notion, what?" Wimsey took the envelope, held it up to the light, and smiled. "Not sealed," he murmured. "Dear me. Either our governess lacked confidence in adhesives, or she wished the contents to be known without the vulgarity of a posthumous disclosure." He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the small firm script of a schoolmistress, and what it contained made Wimsey raise his monocle with something like admiration. It was a list of books. Not a letter, not an accusation, not even a poem. just titles, 20 of them, beginning with The Pilgrim's Progress and ending, perplexingly, with Greenmantle. Beneath the final title was a phrase scribbled in haste. "Begin at the end if you wish to understand the beginning." Whimsy folded the paper with a satisfied sigh. Her governess who reads backwards. How very original. I think we shall have some entertainment after all. And so it began. A death that looked accidental. A list that made no sense. A village too polite for murder. And Lord Peter Wimsey, delighted as ever, nosing out the one thing worse than a corpse at the vestry, bad literary taste. The morning mist lingered over much hollering with the stubbornness of an anxious houseguest, and the bells of St. Cuthbert's tolled the hour with a mournful clang, quite out of keeping with their usual cheerfulness. Lord Peter Wimsey, in no particular haste, lingered in the rectory's drawing-room, sipping a tepid cup of tea, and examining the list Miss Faversham had left with a curiosity sharpened more by style than substance. She chose her titles very deliberately, he remarked to no one in particular. Hardy, Gaskell, Buchan, Bunyan. A peculiar blend of morality, melodrama, and espionage. One might almost call it a spiritual itinerary. The maid, Peggy, round of face and perpetually dusted with flour, was summoned first. She entered with a blend of fear and self-importance, peculiar to those recently upgraded from kitchen to confidant. "Miss Faversham was very quiet, my lord," she began, smoothing her apron. "Never interfered, never late, always the same porridge with nutmeg and cream. Said too much sugar stunted the mind. You could set your watch by her steps." "And did you?" Wimsey inquired mildly. Peggy blinked. "Well, no, sir. It's just something people say. Quite right." "And did she keep any visitors, suitors, assassins, or itinerant missionaries?" "Never had a soul over, sir. Lived alone since I was a babe. Except—" Peggy stopped, glanced at the vicar's wife, then lowered her voice. "Except Mr. Dunning, the bookseller. Came round once a month with a crate of old novels. She'd go through 'em like fire through straw and hand back a fresh list, all numbered and neat as library cards." Wimsey nodded. "And where might I find this Dunning fellow?" "A man who traffics in moral fictions and Victorian sentiment may yet provide a window into Miss Faversham's soul." "High Street, sir." "Next to the dairy. Smells like mildew and marmalade." Peggy was dismissed with a nod, and in her place appeared Mrs. Treadgold, whose nerves had returned under the salutary influence of sherry and rectitude. She insisted with faint asperity that Miss Faversham had no enemies, only admirers. She was a model of discipline, Lord Peter, set an example. The girls in the Sunday school adored her, even when she assigned them Cowper and Coleridge instead of that awful Enid Blyton. She gave a sense of order to the community. "Order is very well," murmured Wimsey, "until it begins to chafe." Mrs. Treadgold stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "Merely a reflection. Those who impose structure are sometimes themselves quite fragmented within. I do hope you're not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," said Wimsey pleasantly. "But if she lived so respectably, why did she leave a note with the rector in anticipation of her own death?" Mrs. Treadgold flushed faintly. That was odd. But Miss Faversham had a nervous constitution. Very precise people often do. She once burst into tears over a misplaced comma in the Book of Common Prayer. That sort. "Indeed. And would you say she was superstitious?" "Good heavens, no. She read the Times and Punch." Wimsey concealed a smile. "That settles it. That settles it." He took his leave then, but not before slipping the note with the book list into his coat pocket. A brisk walk down the High Street brought him to Dunning's Antiquarian Books and Curios, a narrow shop whose front window displayed a curious melange of Kipling, crucifixes, and a faded globe that spun on its own if you coughed hard enough. Mr. Dunning proved to be a ferret-like man, with a walrus moustache and eyes that blinked independently, like mismatched shutters. He greeted Wimsey with suspicion that curdled upon hearing the name into obsequiousness. "Ah yes, Miss Faversham, most devoted of readers. Never tore a page, never left dog-ears. Always requested used copies with notes in the margins. Said the living thoughts of the dead were more honest that way. Curious habit. Did she ever mention why?" "She said," Dunning recited, "that when one reads between the lines, one must have the lines first well creased." Wimsey smiled. "Indeed, and her last request?" "A parcel delivered last week. She said it might be her last. And that she wanted something, what was it, with cold hands and clever fingers. I gave her The Turn of the Screw and a selection of sensation novels. And what did she return to you?" Hers? Dunning rummaged beneath the counter and brought out a parcel bound with twine. Said to hold it until next Thursday, but thank you, said Whimsy, appropriating it before the man could think better of it. And one more question, Mr. Dunning. Have you ever known Miss Faversham to write in her books? Dunning shuddered. Deface them? Never! But Whimsy was already at the door, turning the package over in his hands. Inside, as he discovered minutes later under a yew tree by the churchyard, were 4 slim volumes, 2 Brontes, 1 Hardy, and a reprint of Cranford. All bore the same faint scent of violets and pipe tobacco, and tucked into the final page of Tess of the d'Urbervilles was a hand-penned note. 1 sentence, underlined twice. The proper ending is not always the one they wrote. Whimsy stood for some time, contemplating the phrase while the fog began to thin around the graves. Then, with a half-smile and a shrug that seemed to dismiss and embrace the enigma at once, he turned back toward the rectory, a governess who read backwards. A death framed like an accident, and now a private language composed of books and hidden endings. Somewhere between Bunyan and Buchan, something had gone terribly wrong, and Lord Peter, who had solved puzzles in codes, in corsets, and once in a broken line of Georgian verse, began to suspect that Miss Faversham's greatest mystery might yet be her own. The afternoon brought a brittle sun that did nothing to warm the air, but succeeded in highlighting every irregularity in the village's modest stonework, the lichen on the gravestones, and the furrow in Lord Peter's brow as he leaned over the rectory's oak writing desk. He had spread the book list flat and arranged the 4 returned novels beside it, open at the final pages, each marked in faint pencil with delicate flourishes. Arrows, circlets, underlinings, they were to the untrained eye no more than the idle jottings of an earnest reader. But to Whimsy, who had once unravelled a forgery ring from a careless ligature in a papal bull, there was something too deliberate in the sequence. The markings formed a pattern that wasn't quite alphabetical, chronological, or thematic, but hinted at structure nonetheless. Miss Faversham, he murmured. You were leaving breadcrumbs, weren't you? The vicar hovered nearby, shuffling prayer leaflets in mild unease. I dare say she was eccentric, Lord Peter, but if she were in any real distress she never let on. Not in her speech, her manner. Only that one peculiar comment at Christmas about a shadow on the stairs when no one had walked. Shadows do have an odd way of walking ahead of one, said Whimsy. What did she mean, do you suppose? The vicar pursed his lips. I thought it metaphorical. She had a literary turn. Said strange things sometimes. Once told me that silence in a room can mean someone has spoken, only no one wants to admit it. A linguistic ghost, how very modern. Whimsy stood abruptly. I should like to speak with the Radlets if they're available. The Radlets? Oh, you mean over at Lime Tree Cottage. He's a clerk for the council. She runs a sort of piano circle. Nothing scandalous, quite. But didn't their daughter recently return from the school where Miss Faversham taught? Yes, Beryl. Sent home after an incident, though no one would say what. The girl's been rather odd since. Children often see what adults politely ignore, Whimsy said. May I? The vicar nodded, though not without the faint expression of a man who suspected that things were moving beyond the scope of decency. Lime Tree Cottage had a neatness one could only describe as apologetic. The garden was rigidly clipped, and the lace curtains never quite sat flush with the windows. Mrs. Radlett answered the door with a smile so fixed it must have taken rehearsals. Lord Peter was charm itself. I shan't stay long, madam. Only a word, if I may, about your daughter's time with Miss Faversham. Oh, said Mrs. Radlett, her smile tightening. Of course. Beryl's just taking her elocution lessons. But I'll fetch her. She returned with a thin girl of about 12, who wore a blue cardigan fastened all the way to her throat and held a thumb-worn copy of Black Beauty like a talisman. Beryl looked at Whimsy directly, unblinking. Are you here because of Miss Faversham? She asked, skipping pleasantries. Yes, he replied gently. You were fond of her, I take it. She smelled of library paste and lavender, Beryl said. She liked words. Said some of them were dangerous and should be kept in cages. But she never shouted. Only once. When was that? Last September, after I got the composition prize. She read my poem and went all white. Then she said, Don't ever use that word again, and made me tear it up. What word do you remember? Beryl thought. Epistle. I don't know why. It's not even a bad word. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. No, indeed. Quite scriptural. Did she say anything else? Beryl nodded. She asked me if I believed in remembering things backwards, like starting with what you wanted, and then seeing what had to happen to get there. I thought it was a puzzle. She was fond of puzzles. I think she was scared of one. Mrs. Radlett coughed behind them, signaling the end of the interview, and Whimsy bowed himself out, hat in hand. He walked slowly back to the churchyard, pausing by the stone angel that wept eternally over the Melbury twins, who had died of scarlet fever in 1873. The angel's left wing had chipped, and someone had tried to repair it with plaster. Epistle, he murmured. An odd trigger. But one must follow where the trail leads. In the church, he asked P.C. Weatherby, still stationed near the vestry, solemn and damp as a forgotten sponge, whether anything had been found on Miss Faversham's person. A handkerchief, a key, and one of them little wax pencils. My lord, could I see the key? Weatherby produced it from a brown envelope. It was small, brass, and unremarkable, save for a tag, worn but legible. Box 14, bank deposit box? The constable ventured. Whimsy shook his head. I doubt it. Too impersonal. More likely a cabinet, a drawer, a filing system. Has anyone searched her home thoroughly? Only a quick look, sir. All proper, like. Nothing out of place. Let's put that theory to the test. The cottage on Apple Tree Row was, as expected, impeccably ordered. Miss Faversham, it seemed, had labelled her linen drawer by thread count and her pantry by expiration date. Whimsy moved through the rooms with the quiet precision of a man untroubled by disarray, but intrigued by its opposite. In the study, a modest affair with a writing desk, 2 chairs and a severely Protestant selection of moral fiction, he found what he was looking for. A cabinet tucked under the eaves bore small brass tags, 1 through 20. Box 14 opened with a click. Inside, bound in blue ribbon, were 12 compositions from various pupils, all marked and annotated, and at the bottom, beneath a folded page of arithmetic, was a single, unsent letter. The ink was smudged, as if the writer had hesitated. It was addressed to Mr. Quentin Vane, solicitor, Wilkes and Harbury, Linchester. Whimsy unfolded it. Sir, I write to amend my earlier instructions concerning the trust in which I am named. I must insist that under no circumstances should the contents be dispersed without full clarification of the original beneficiary's condition, as I now have reason to believe. The letter broke off. No signature, no date. But the handwriting was unmistakably hers, Quentin Vane. That name had not appeared in any interviews thus far, nor in the local directory. But it had the uncomfortable smell of legal entanglement, inheritance, guardianship, or something more clandestine. Whimsy tucked the letter into his coat and looked once more around the study. Everything in place. Every drawer dusted, yet he could not shake the sensation, faint but persistent, that someone had tried very hard to appear as though they lived simply. But the truth, he suspected, was anything but simple. It was the sort of morning that tried, unsuccessfully, to pass for spring. Sunlight filtered through bare branches with a guilty air, and the frost on the gateposts had retreated just enough to show the rust underneath. Lord Peter Whimsy stepped into Linchester, a market town only 15 miles from much hollering, but inclined in manner and ambition to pretend the distance was greater. Its high street was more kempt, its pavements less pitted, and its station-master wore his moustache with a self-regard that suggested full orchestral accompaniment. Wilkes and Harbury, solicitors and commissioners for oaths, occupied a prim Georgian frontage between a tea-room and an optician's. The firm's brass plate gleamed with the quiet intensity of a well-funded endowment. Whimsy, bearing neither subpoena nor grievance, announced himself with his usual courtesy, and was ushered into a room of grey carpet, grey chairs, and grey files. It smelled faintly of leather bindings, damp wool and moral certainty. Quentin Vane, when he arrived, was younger than expected, perhaps not yet 40, with thick black hair and a pair of rimless spectacles that made his eyes appear larger and more startled than they likely were. He bowed deferentially, with the precision of a man who had once been warned against spontaneous gestures. "My lord," he said, "I understand you're making inquiries into the unfortunate death of Miss Faversham." "Indeed," said Whimsy, taking the offered chair. "I found her letter unfinished in her home. It was addressed to you concerning a trust. Vane's expression held for a moment, then adjusted by degrees into polite regret. A delicate matter. Miss Faversham was named trustee to an educational bequest, a modest fund left by a Miss Honoria Langley for the benefit of her great-niece, should she pass certain examinations. There were stipulations. Miss Faversham took them quite seriously, as one might expect from a woman who labelled her spice jars alphabetically. Did the niece ever receive the funds? No. Vane tapped a blotter with one long finger. Miss Faversham had concerns. She suspected irregularities in the girl's identity. She asked for further documentation. Then last year she wrote to say she had confirmed the girl was the rightful heir and authorized the release. Wimsey tilted his head. But now she was attempting to reverse that decision? It would seem so, Vane sighed. There were no funds yet disbursed. The girl, Edith Langley, was meant to begin at St. Catherine's College this autumn. Miss Faversham's second letter had not yet reached me. Do you know Edith? Only by correspondence. She writes in a very cultivated hand. Wimsey smiled faintly. As did Miss Faversham, and yet she left her last letter unfinished. That, to my mind, suggests haste or fear, or both. Perhaps she had second thoughts, Vane said, but his voice lacked conviction. Quite. And tell me, was anyone else involved in these arrangements? Mr. Hubert Chance, I believe, a cousin to the original Miss Langley. He wrote urging Miss Faversham to expedite matters. Wimsey made a mental note of the name. And where might I find this paragon of philanthropy? London. Bloomsbury, I believe. He gave the impression of a literary man. Something in publishing. The conversation veered into platitudes after that, and Wimsey withdrew with his usual blend of courtesy and unnerving precision. As he stepped outside, he paused to light a cigarette, drawing on it slowly while a lorry trundled past bearing crates of celery. His eyes narrowed. It was not merely that Miss Faversham had doubted the girl's identity, it was that she had doubted it twice. First withheld the funds, then released them, then attempted to withdraw her consent. That bespoke not indecision, but conflicting information. And somewhere between the first and last letter, she had learned something that frightened her. Back in Much Hollering by late afternoon, Wimsey made his way to the village school. The headmistress, a florid woman with an alarming brooch shaped like a hedgehog, greeted him with something between reverence and anxiety. Miss Faversham was a model of consistency, she said. After the proper condolences were exchanged, she came every Wednesday. Reading comprehension, Latin roots, dictation. Never once absent. Did she ever mention Edith Langley? The headmistress frowned. I believe she once referred to her in staff meeting, a girl she tutored by correspondence. Said she was too clever by half, meaning. Miss Faversham didn't trust natural intelligence unshaped by discipline. She thought cleverness without obedience was a recipe for ruin. She had no patience for children who answered questions they weren't asked. Wimsey nodded. And did she ever complain of being followed? Or threatened? The woman's eyes widened. Good heavens, no, though. Now you say it, last autumn she started carrying an umbrella even on dry days. Said she'd heard footsteps once, late at night, when no one should have been near her house. Wimsey considered that. Did she mention it to the police? I doubt it. She preferred internal solutions, such as reading Green Mantle and leaving cryptic bibliographies. The headmistress blinked, unsure whether she had been made the butt of a joke. Wimsey offered her a bow and took his leave before the silence could solidify into offence. As dusk crept across the village and the air chilled with that peculiar inland cold that respects no calendar, Wimsey walked once more to Miss Faversham's cottage. He let himself in with the key the vicar had produced and sat quietly in the parlour, listening. There was something unnerving in the absolute stillness of the place, not the calm of peace but the brittle quiet of repression. The ticking clock was the only sound, and its rhythm was off. A half-second hesitation on the 12th tick, like a breath held too long. He stood and turned the key in box 14 again, examining the compositions. On impulse, he pulled out the piece written in the most ornate florid hand, no doubt belonging to the mysterious Edith Langley. He read, "Morality must be enforced through clarity of law, not sentiment. The sentimentalist forgives before understanding. That is an act of tyranny." It was a strange thing for a teenage girl to write. The tone was not precocious but practiced, as if the writer were mimicking something older, more deliberate. And suddenly a memory bloomed in Whimsy's mind, something Beryl had said. She said some words should be kept in cages. That sentence. That composition. That phrase. Whimsy returned to the list Miss Faversham had left. The books were not random. They were keys. Each one marked a pattern of language, of structure. Pilgrim's Progress, Cranford, Greenmantle. Books in which names were fictions, identities assumed, lives reconstructed. She had been tracking something or someone who had written like an adult, someone pretending to be a girl. Miss Faversham had caught it. Then hesitated. Then died. Whimsy stood slowly, a familiar tightness settling in his chest. Not fear, but the sense that something unnatural had posed itself within the natural order and remained undetected, simply because no one wished to name it. He folded the composition carefully and pocketed it. Whoever Edith Langley was, she was not a schoolgirl, and somewhere in London, under the name of Hubert Chance, was a man who knew exactly why Miss Faversham had to die. By the time Lord Peter Wimsey reached London the next morning, the sky had settled into a neutral grey, as if the heavens themselves preferred to reserve judgment. The city bustled with the mechanical energy of the work week, all ticking clocks and shine shoes, but Wimsey, trailing the scent of pipe smoke and book dust from much hollering, moved with deliberate idleness through Bloomsbury. It was not an area unfamiliar to him, nor, he suspected, to Mr. Hubert Chance, whose supposed business in publishing reeked faintly of the imaginary. Wimsey found the address listed in the solicitor's files with curious ease. Number 38, Tavistock Crescent, a thin townhouse with a cracked lintel and a brass door-knocker, shaped like a sphinx, an unfortunate choice for a man attempting to conceal riddles. He rapped thrice and was answered after a delay by a man who seemed composed of second-hand parts, thinning hair brushed with fastidious care, wire spectacles, and a suit at odds with the season, a summer grey with a frayed cuff and the sheen of dry-cleaning overuse. Mr. Chance, I presume? Whimsy's tone was light, almost musical. Yes, came the guarded reply. Can I help you? I rather think you must. Lord Peter Wimsey. He extended a hand and smiled. We've a mutual acquaintance, or rather we had. Miss Muriel Faversham. Miss Muriel Faversham. Mr. Chance's expression remained still, save for the blink that took slightly too long to complete. I see. I heard something about her death. Tragic, indeed. A neck quite dashed to pieces, I'm afraid. The sort of misfortune that might happen to anyone who becomes inconvenient at the wrong time. Chance stepped aside. Perhaps you'd better come in. The flat was tidy in the way a hotel room is tidy, sparsely decorated, no clutter, and very little to suggest the personality of its occupant. A faint smell of beeswax polish lingered in the air. Wimsey noted the absence of books, odd for a man in publishing. You'll forgive me, Chance said, offering a low chair with thin upholstery, but I don't see what Miss Faversham's unfortunate end has to do with me. Wimsey studied him as one might a moth pinned in a museum drawer. That depends. You were in correspondence with her concerning the Langley Trust. Yes, I encouraged her to release the funds. The girl had met the criteria, had she? Wimsey's tone sharpened only slightly. Miss Faversham, in her final note, appeared to think otherwise. Chance shrugged. She changed her mind. Elderly people sometimes do. She was not elderly, Mr. Chance. She was 57. Nor was she given to caprice. And she died, how curious, just as she was attempting to rescind her authorization. Would you happen to know what prompted her doubt? I wouldn't presume. No. But you corresponded with her. Rather a lot. According to Vane's file, you sent no fewer than 8 letters urging her to confirm the girl's identity and release the inheritance. I was advocating on Edith's behalf. She was in need. Need is not quite the same as truth, is it? Chance's fingers drummed once, then stopped. Lord Peter, if you're accusing me— I'm doing no such thing, Wimsey said pleasantly. I'm simply remarking that Miss Faversham's suspicions were awfully inconvenient for someone. Someone who may have known that the girl calling herself Edith Langley was, shall we say, not precisely who she pretended to be. Do you have proof of that? Chance asked. Not yet. But I do have the girl's writing, and I have read it. You see, I read rather a lot of things. Greek tragedy, forensic reports, cookbooks, everything leaves a trace, and the hand behind those compositions wasn't adolescent. It was theatrical, polished, and derivative. Not in a schoolgirl's way. In a mimic's. Chance folded his arms. You're proposing she's a fraud? I'm proposing, said Whimsy, that Miss Faversham realized someone was writing on the girl's behalf, or that the girl was a fiction entirely. And she died before she could make that knowledge official. For a moment silence reigned. Then Chance said with surprising calm, "Do you know what it is to want to undo a past mistake?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "You made one?" Chance didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Honoria Langley was my aunt. She left me nothing. She hated men. When I learned she'd left the trust to Edith, on condition she passed certain benchmarks, I helped her. I made sure she passed, by manufacturing evidence. She was bright," Chance snapped, "but not bright enough for Honoria's absurd conditions. So I guided her, shaped her work, polished the rough edges." "Assuming she exists at all," Chance hesitated. "She does. Where is she?" "In France." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Of course she is. And do you have her address?" "No, I see." He rose. "Well then, Mr. Chance, you'll forgive me if I check with the Foreign Office. Travel records, immigration logs, school admission rolls, those dull details, you see. They're terribly good at pointing out people who don't exist." Chance stood as well, face pale. "This is absurd. Possibly. But you see, absurdity has a certain scent when it turns to murder." Outside, the street noise returned with a peculiar clarity. Bells, buses, and a woman laughing on the far side of the square. Whimsy turned his collar against the wind and took a few steps toward the cab rank, then paused. There was something about the flat, too clean, too curated. He turned back, slipped round the alley behind the house and waited. After 20 minutes, Chance emerged by the back door, coatless and nervous, clutching a thin envelope. He walked quickly, turning twice before taking a right into a quiet lane off Russell Square. Whimsy followed at a distance. The man entered a modest lodging house. Whimsy waited 3 minutes, then followed, presenting his card to the landlady with a flash of charm and invented urgency. "Looking for my cousin, bit of a scatterbrain. Think he may have left something." The landlady, flustered by the sudden attention of a peer of the realm, waved him upstairs. The room at the end of the hall was unlocked. Inside, Whimsy found what he expected. A trunk, half-packed, letters addressed to 3 different aliases, and tucked into the back of a drawer, a passport photo of a woman no older than 25 with pale eyes and a guarded smile. On the back, scrawled in pencil, E.L. Tell no one. Wait until the 15th. Use the Brighton name, So. Edith Langley was either real and on the run or invented with alarming care. Whimsy stepped out into the corridor just in time to hear footsteps on the stairs. He tucked the photograph into his pocket and moved quickly, silently, down the back stairs and into the fog that now crept in over London like a burglar unpicking a lock. There was a performance being staged, and not just in a schoolgirl's essays. A carefully cast deception, lines rehearsed and redrafted. But Miss Faversham had noticed. She had read it backwards, and she had died for doing so. But Lord Peter Whimsy was not yet ready for the curtain to fall. Whimsy arrived back in much hollering as evening fell, bringing with him the kind of London chill that seeps into the bones and lingers in village parlours like an unwelcome guest. He did not immediately return to the rectory, but instead detoured past the churchyard, where the silhouette of St. Cuthbert's bell tower stretched long and crooked across the ground. The vestry door, now secured with a crude iron bolt, looked more like the entrance to a crypt than the humble workspace where Miss Faversham had drawn her final breath. He stood for a moment beneath the bare-limbed yew, turning the photograph over in his hand. The woman in the image, E.L. as she was labelled, was too composed to be the schoolgirl she purported to be. Her gaze was steady, not the open inquisitiveness of youth, but the polished awareness of someone who had already measured herself against the world. And perhaps measured Miss Faversham too. The next morning, over a breakfast of eggs done badly by the vicar's cook and coffee that tasted faintly of piety and aluminium, Whimsy laid out his theory to a silent but rapt audience, Reverend Treadgold, his wife, and the increasingly alert P.C. Weatherby. "I believe," said Whimsy, dabbing his mouth with excessive delicacy, "that Miss Muriel Faversham discovered herself caught in a trap constructed out of loyalty, guilt, and manipulation. She was, at some point in the last 18 months, persuaded, perhaps by flattery, perhaps by emotional pressure, to act as guarantor for a young woman's identity. Mrs. Treadgold clutched her pearls. But for what purpose? Ah, said Whimsy, the very question. What is the value of a false identity? It could be escape, inheritance, espionage, even simply the pleasure of deceit. But in this case, I believe it was access. The Langley Trust. A tidy sum tied to conditions. Pass your exams. Prove your virtue. Be the correct person and the money is yours. But if the girl wasn't Edith Langley, murmured Treadgold, she may never have existed. Or she may have existed once, only to vanish. Either way, a counterfeit was constructed in her place. Letters were written, compositions submitted. Perhaps an interview or two staged under careful control. Miss Faversham, known for her exactitude, must have sensed inconsistencies. A style too sophisticated, a photograph too mature. Her phrase, words in cages that didn't fit the mouth it came from. Weatherby blinked. So the governess knew. She suspected. Enough to delay the release of the funds. Then something changed. Someone convinced her or coerced her into signing the approval. And then, very shortly after, she tried to reverse it, Mrs. Treadgold whispered. And then she died. Whimsy nodded. Indeed. But how? Asked Weatherby. She was found at the vestry steps. No marks, no signs of a struggle. Just a broken neck. If it was murder, it was silent. Whimsy leaned back. It was silent. That's the beauty of it. There was no need for violence in the traditional sense. Miss Faversham, I suggest, was lured to the vestry under pretext, perhaps to meet someone she thought she knew and trusted. There she was struck, not with a blunt instrument, but with a fall. A push carefully calculated. A single step backwards. You'd be surprised how little it takes to crack a cervical vertebra if the angle is precise. He paused. And she was found lying on her back, yes? One hand folded, the other distorted. Weatherby nodded slowly. Looked unnatural. Precisely. The kind of fall that doesn't come from tripping. It comes from being handled. Mrs. Treadgold made a small sound of distress and stared into her coffee cup as if it might offer absolution. Whimsy stood. If you'll excuse me, I have one more errand. I believe it's time I return to the books. He meant it literally. Back at Miss Faversham's cottage, the key still in his possession, Whimsy let himself in and made straight for the study. The cabinet drawers held no further secrets. He had already plundered box 14, but the book list still tugged at him. 20 titles, 20 clues, some marked, some not. He had assumed the order was symbolic, literary. But now he considered the possibility of the literal. He sat at her desk and arranged the books again by the order on the list. Then he did what no self-respecting bibliophile would ever do. He shook them, spine downward, page edges loose. The 5th book, Jane Eyre, yielded a slip of onion skin paper, yellowed and stiff. On it a typewritten passage. Unlike Miss Faversham's usual hand, should anything befall me, know that the girl's name is not Edith. I do not know her real name. I was made to believe. I see now it was performance. She never once spoke like a child. There is something in her that frightens me, something cold, calculating. I see it now. I should not have vouched for her. I should not have trusted. The letter ended there, the rest torn or never completed. Whimsy sat very still. The emphasis, he now realized, was not just on deception, but on performance. That word again. A constructed persona, and someone behind it with a very real interest in maintaining the illusion. The silence of the cottage pressed in. Then something new. A sound. Footsteps on gravel. Whimsy rose quickly and peered through the curtain. A figure, small, slim in a green coat, was walking down the lane toward the cottage. He watched as she paused at the gate. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply looked up at the house. And even at this distance, Whimsy could see her face. It was the woman from the photograph, not a child, not a schoolgirl, and certainly not Edith Langley. Whimsy stepped away from the window and moved silently through the house, exiting by the back and circling round. He waited, concealed behind the privet hedge, as the woman finally stepped up to the door. Her hand reached into her pocket. He moved then, quietly but unmistakably, stepping into the path behind her. "Forgive me," he said, "but I believe you've misplaced your name." She froze, then turned slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, not in the voice of a girl, but with the weary precision of a woman used to rehearsing, "It doesn't matter. You're too late." You can't prove what I didn't do." "On the contrary," said Whimsy softly, "I can prove exactly what you tried to do, and the only thing I don't yet know, miss, whoever you are, is whether you pushed Miss Faversham yourself, or convinced someone else to do it for you." She didn't blink, but her hand closed around the object in her coat pocket, not a weapon, a key. Whimsy saw it glint and knew. There was more. A final lockbox, perhaps. A place where her story, real or otherwise, had been stored away, waiting to be found or destroyed. He smiled faintly. "I say," he murmured, "what is the Brighton name?" She hesitated. Just a flicker, but enough for Lord Peter Whimsy to know he had struck the fragile membrane that separated the carefully composed fiction from the unruly truth. The hand in her coat pocket stilled. Slowly, she withdrew the key and turned it over in her palm, the brass catching the pale light. It was older than he expected, dull-edged and hand-filed. Something not meant for bank vaults or modern lockers, but for an attic, a hope chest, or a time long since abandoned. "So," she said at last, her voice low, weary, but still under exquisite control. "You know." "Not everything," Whimsy said, adjusting his cuffs with exaggerated casualness. "Merely that your resemblance to a girl of 17 is less than compelling. Your handwriting is suspiciously curated, and your choice of literary references entirely too pointed. Green Mantle is an excellent novel, but not standard fare for schoolgirls. Nor is Schopenhauer, I dare say." She gave a faint laugh, brittle as old glass. "She would have liked that, you noticed. Miss Faversham?" "No, Honoria Langley." "Ah, yes." The original patroness, spinster, misanthrope, militant rationalist, left her fortune to a great niece on the condition that she pass a moral and academic proving ground. "It was a test," she said quietly. "And I passed." "But you weren't the one being tested," Whimsy replied gently. "You simply wore the mask." Silence again. Then, "I never meant to hurt her." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "And yet she is quite thoroughly dead. I wanted her frightened," she said, the words coming fast now. "Shaken. Just enough that she'd write to the solicitor and amend the letter. Just enough that I could step away from all of it before they closed in. So I went to the vestry to talk to her, but she fell. I didn't touch her. Did you arrange the meeting?" She nodded. "I left a note. Posed as Chance's clerk. Said something about discrepancies in the trust. I thought she'd come, she'd be scared, I'd explain it was all a mistake, and she'd agree to write a retraction. But she was already furious. She'd uncovered things, files, papers, the fake tuition records. She wasn't just going to back down. She threatened exposure. She said she'd go to the police. That I was a fraud. That she'd testify. And so she fell. I swear to you, I didn't push her." She turned, stepped wrong. "I was going to help her, but then I thought, no one saw me. No one knew I was there." Whimsy watched her carefully. Her composure was a taut thread fraying at the edges. And yet he believed her, at least about the fall. What he didn't believe was that she had come only to frighten Miss Faversham. No one risks exposure after months of orchestration without desperation. And desperation makes the hands do strange things. "What's your real name?" he asked softly. She looked up, eyes wide and exhausted. "Elizabeth Carmody. Where is the real Edith Langley?" She said nothing. Whimsy sighed. "Missing, is she?" A long pause, then she died. 6 years ago, pneumonia in a boarding house in Nice. No family left. I was living in the next room. She had the same accent, same height, same age. We shared a few meals. One night she told me her aunt had left her a fund in trust. I asked questions. Too many. She got spooked. Told me to leave her alone. And then she died. I recognized the name months later. Saw it in the Gazette. Honoria Langley had died. The trust was in probate. I remembered what Edith had told me, about the conditions, grades, correspondence, nothing in person. I thought, why shouldn't I try? No one cared. No one ever checked. Whimsy nodded. So you began your audition. Letters, essays, references, all carefully forged. I had help at first. Chance believed in me. Her in the money. Whimsy's mouth twisted. They usually do. She was the first person who saw through it, Elizabeth whispered. Miss Faversham. At first she was warm. Then she grew cold. The day she tore up that schoolgirl's poem, Beryl's, wasn't it? I saw the panic in her eyes. She had recognized something. A phrase I'd used before. She knew. And she still went to meet you. She had the letter ready for the solicitor. She wanted to hand it over in person, to make sure you saw the door shutting. She didn't deserve to die, Elizabeth said. I didn't kill her. I left her lying there and I ran. That was my crime. I left. Whimsy was silent. The breeze stirred the privet leaves beside them, and a dog barked faintly across the fields. She left a note, he said at last, hidden in Jane Eyre of all places. Remarkably fitting. Elizabeth looked away. I have only one more question, he said. The Brighton name. What was it for? She didn't answer immediately. Then a clean exit. A new start. I had a passport, papers, a room rented under that name. Just in case. Just in case it all went wrong. It has, she nodded. It has, she nodded. Footsteps sounded behind them. P.C. Weatherby, puffing slightly, emerged at the gate. Whimsy had sent for him before confronting her, a precaution he rarely skipped. Elizabeth looked from the constable to Whimsy, her face unreadable now. Then she reached into her coat slowly and held out the key. It's to a locker, she said. Paddington Station. Inside, everything. The forged records, the old letters, the photo I stole of Edith, the files I faked. It's all there. Weatherby hesitated, then took the key. You'll come with me, miss, he said. Almost gently, she nodded again and turned toward the gate. Her hands steady, her pace even. Whimsy watched them go, the two figures shrinking against the hedgerow, until they turned and disappeared into the lane. Only then did he exhale. Back at the rectory that evening, he declined supper and instead took a solitary turn around the garden, the night full of damp soil and the scent of early hyacinth. He thought of Miss Faversham, her meticulous world, her cautious sense of right and wrong, her final attempt to put something broken back in place. He thought, too, of Elizabeth Carmody, neither hero nor villain, only another weary player on a stage where the script had run out. The law would handle the rest. The files would be retrieved. The case would be closed. But still, he wondered, how many others were reading backwards? How many lives built from borrowed pages? And how many endings had already been rewritten, quietly before anyone thought to notice? The following morning dawned mild and colourless, a pale gauze of cloud hanging over much Hollering, like the breath of some dozing giant. Lord Peter Whimsy, in no particular hurry, sat at the breakfast table once again with the Treadgolds, holding his toast like a paperweight as he listened to the wireless mumble a pastoral weather report. It was Reverend Treadgold who finally broke the silence. So it's over then. The woman, the impostor, has been taken in. There'll be a trial, I assume, perhaps a headline or two, and then we'll all go on. Whimsy gave a non-committal nod, swirling his tea. We go on, yes, though rarely in the same direction. Mrs. Treadgold, ever the moral compass of the household, looked perturbed. But surely she'll be charged. The fraud alone, if not the death. Oh, certainly. She has confessed to assuming Edith Langley's identity, forging documents and fabricating her qualifications. That, quite alone, is sufficient for the Crown to take an interest. As for the death of Miss Faversham, well, he paused, delicately extracting a sliver of orange marmalade from under his nail with the butter knife. That's more complicated. She said she didn't push her, Treadgold offered, uncertain. She did, and I believe her. Or rather, I believe she didn't intend harm. Not that intention is the sole currency in these matters. Morally speaking, she opened the door and stood aside, but she ran. As did Cain. It's not a reliable test of guilt. He stood, brushing non-existent crumbs from his lapel. It's often the most desperate performances that collapse not from flaws in the script, but from the sheer weight of pretending. Miss Faversham's death was not a murder in the usual sense. It was an accident shaped by lies. Lies that had grown too large to hold. Weatherby arrived just past 10, looking flushed and resolute, and handed Whimsy a plain brown envelope, with the sort of reverence usually reserved for coronation medals. They've opened the locker at Paddington, my lord. Just as she said. Dozens of documents, passports, letters, academic certificates, some in the name of Edith Langley, others as Elizabeth Carmody, even one as Julia Thorne. Whimsy raised a brow. The Brighton name. Looks like she had an exit planned from every angle, Weatherby said. There's more. Letters to Mr. Chance, some rather pointed. She threatened to expose him unless he kept helping. Blackmail, sir. Indeed. I rather thought he was not motivated by sentiment. Whimsy flipped the envelope open. Inside were copies of several letters. Typed, but with occasional annotations in Elizabeth's handwriting, he read the last line of one aloud. "You know I can end this story as easily as I began it. If you wish to be remembered as a footnote rather than a chapter, you'll comply." Charming. So she was blackmailing him? Not quite. She was holding him to the plot. He agreed to help write the narrative. But when Miss Faversham started rewriting the ending, well, that made everyone nervous. Weatherby hesitated. The Crown prosecution may still press for manslaughter. There's precedent. Reckless endangerment leading to fatality. Quite. And I imagine the jury will enjoy the theatricality. A governess, a fraudulent heiress, a forged education. It reads better than most novels. He folded the letters and tucked them into his coat. "Have you questioned Chance further?" "He's vanished," Weatherby said grimly. "Packed up, left no forwarding address. The flat in Bloomsbury's been cleared out. But he's on the list now. Passport flagged. We'll find him." "Oh, I imagine he'll turn up in Algiers or Milan or possibly Cheltenham," Whimsy said breezily. "Men like Chance tend not to vanish entirely. They merely blur." Later that afternoon, as the sky began to dissolve into a soggy, uncertain dusk, Whimsy paid one final visit to Miss Faversham's cottage. The keys, reluctantly surrendered by the village solicitor, gave him entry for what would likely be the last time before the estate was claimed by whichever relative still held a moral claim on her linen and teaspoons. He walked through the rooms slowly. The order still reigned, but the atmosphere had altered. The cottage no longer seemed preserved. It felt paused, as though waiting for the resumption of something that would never return. He stopped in the study, where a shaft of muted light fell across the desk. There he laid the photograph, the one of the woman posing as Edith Langley, face down beside the handwritten list of books. He traced the titles once more. They were not clues in the traditional sense, not ciphers or symbols. They were warnings, each one chosen for a story in which identity faltered, where people pretended to be what they were not, where names were masks. Hand-truth was bent to suit the drama. Miss Faversham had left her message not in a diary or a will, but in fiction. She had read the world through the lens she trusted most. Story. And when she realized she was a character in someone else's tale, one being written by false hands, she had tried to reclaim authorship. Too late. Whimsy sat in her armchair, hands folded. The stillness suited him. He thought of all the little performances. Chance with his publishing mask, Elizabeth with her forged credentials, even the village itself with its carefully maintained myth of harmlessness. Everyone had been playing at something, even Miss Faversham in her own way. And he, Lord Peter Deathbread Whimsy, had played his part, too, the brilliant amateur, nosing into secrets with ironic detachment and a monocle set precisely askew. But there was something about this case that left a bitterness behind, a faint scent of decay that clung even after the window had been opened, because Miss Faversham had not died for justice or revenge, or any of the great passions that usually accompanied such endings. She had died for disappointment. She had tried to believe, and it had undone her. He rose and turned to go. At the door he paused, casting one last glance back at the room, now only a frame without its subject. As he pulled the door shut behind him, he murmured, almost as if to the house itself, "Be careful what parts you audition for. Some scripts don't end where you think they will." And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy stepped into the twilight, the soft tread of his shoes fading into the village hush, leaving behind only dust, paper, and a mystery now written to its final page. The next morning, under a brittle sky that threatened snow despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived, Whimsy returned to London with a faint unease trailing him like a forgotten cough. There were no loose ends, not precisely. Elizabeth Carmody was in custody, the fraudulent papers catalogued, and Chance flagged for inevitable arrest. But the case had failed somehow to resolve itself into that satisfying click of moral symmetry he usually relied on to draw the curtain. Instead, it hovered, unfinished. Not because facts were lacking, but because something within those facts remained oblique, a tone out of key, a syllable out of rhythm. He spent the afternoon at the London Library, leafing through Honoria Langley's surviving correspondence, most of it fussy, waspish, and glinting with contempt for her extended family. The real Edith, it seemed, had been barely tolerated, a name on a family tree rather than a person. There was no mention of Elizabeth Carmody, but then he hadn't expected one. Honoria had loathed drama. It was while he was reading an annotated volume of The Tragic Muse, previously owned by Miss Faversham, according to the bookplate, that he found it. A single margin note in ink no longer made, faint but legible, beside a passage about deception in the theatre of politics. Some lies require applause to work. Some only need silence. That, he thought, might well have been Muriel Faversham's epigraph. Later in his Piccadilly flat, with Bunter unobtrusively pressing a warmed whiskey into his hand and the gas fire ticking softly behind him, Whimsy stared at the ceiling and spoke aloud, more to the room than to the manservant. "There's something peculiar about the whole business, Bunter. I don't mean criminally. It's watertight enough. But it rings false, or rather falsely true." Bunter, ever judicious, merely inclined his head. "I keep thinking of that list," Whimsy went on, "her bookshelf epitaph. Those 20 titles. She was leaving more than a breadcrumb trail. She was leaving herself. Each choice a fragment of her understanding. She didn't just suspect Elizabeth was an imposter. She saw herself reflected in her. You believe Miss Faversham sympathized? Worse, I think she identified." He sipped the whiskey and watched the firelight stutter on the hearth tiles. What if Muriel Faversham saw, in Elizabeth, a version of herself that had simply gone further? A fellow reader, a fellow forger of appearances, one who had simply dared to step into the fiction completely? We dismiss Miss Faversham as meticulous, repressed, even priggish, but what if that rigidity was armor? What if she had spent her whole life performing the role expected of her, the moral bulwark, the spinster instructress, the guardian of standards? Miss Faversham, Bunter said dryly, was rather fierce about the placement of teaspoons. If I recall the house inventory, exactly, control, an obsession with external order, always a hint of something unspoken behind it. And then, along comes Elizabeth, spinning her web of falsehoods not for personal gain but to become someone else entirely. A complete metamorphosis. Fraud, yes, but an artist of identity. Whimsy set down his glass. What if, Bunter, Miss Faversham was less offended than envious? Bunter made no comment, but his silence had a shaded quality to it, the kind that suggested he was already considering the logistical implications. She recognized the act because she had been performing herself. Perhaps she even admired it initially, but admiration curdled into self-loathing. When she finally tried to stop it, it was because she realized how deep she herself had been drawn into the fiction, that she had become not just a witness but a collaborator. And that realization killed her, Bunter said softly. No. Whimsy shook his head. But it made her careless, vulnerable. She allowed herself to be alone with someone she knew she could no longer trust, not just Elizabeth, but herself. There was a long silence between them. The fire shifted, settling like an old man sighing in sleep. At length Bunter said, "The constables have requested a copy of your report, my lord. Shall I include this interpretation?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "No, let them have the facts. The law requires them. Truth is another matter." The next day he visited Holloway, not out of duty. He rarely indulged in interviews with accused criminals once the case was solved, but out of a kind of literary obligation. Elizabeth Carmody had, after all, been the most compelling character in her own story. She sat across from him in the stark visiting room, no longer composed, but not crumbling either. Her eyes were clearer, unadorned by performance now, and she wore the drab grey of institutional limbo with a kind of grateful humility. "You came," she said. "I thought you might. I wanted to ask one thing," he said. "Why the books? Oh, why leave her a trail?" Elizabeth smiled, wry, rueful. "Because I knew she'd understand. She always understood things before anyone else. She didn't stop me because she couldn't see through me. She stopped me because she saw too far past me." "To what?" "To herself," Whimsy nodded. "She was trying to save you. She thought so. But really, she wanted to be saved from the parts of herself she saw reflected in me. I reminded her of who she wasn't supposed to be. That's why it frightened her. That's why she died." Whimsy stood. "She didn't die because you frightened her. She died because the story stopped making sense, and she'd lived too long by the rules of narrative truth. She needed the world to resolve, and it wouldn't. You broke the frame." Elizabeth looked up. "And now what?" "Now," said Whimsy, "you must live with the footnotes." Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping coldly through the streets as if scouring the city for forgotten truths. Whimsy lit a cigarette with his back to the prison gates and stood still for a long moment, watching the smoke dissolve into the air. It wasn't justice, not precisely. But perhaps it was closure in the peculiar, uneven form that reality allowed. He flicked the ash away and began the walk back through London's brittle morning, the soles of his shoes clicking sharply on the paving stones, each step ringing like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very human sentence. The final threads of the case drew themselves in with the slow, unshowy inevitability of dusk falling on a November afternoon, quiet, inevitable, and faintly unsatisfying. Hubert Chance, former publisher, reluctant forger and slippery accomplice, was arrested 3 weeks later in a pension in Bruges, living under the elegant but implausible name of Mr. Maxwell Charrington. He surrendered without fuss, remarking only that the plot had rather gone off script, before requesting his solicitor and a pair of shoes with laces. The newspapers, once alerted, took to the tale with predictable gusto. The impostor heiress, spinster sleuth's fatal fall, bookshelf betrayal, the governess who read too much. They turned Miss Faversham into a kind of minor martyr, the moral guardian of a rural community, as the Daily Express solemnly declared, felled by an education scam with Shakespearean overtones. No one, Whimsy noted, mentioned her fondness for scenting the linen cupboard with dried lemon peel, or her irritation at incorrect use of the subjunctive. The public rarely wept for the precise. Whimsy, for his part, withdrew from the affair with the discretion of a man who has come to understand the limits of cleverness. He submitted his report to the authorities, declined to give comment to the Illustrated News, and returned, after a perfunctory visit to his club to the country, where Bunter had prepared the library at Duke's Denver with an array of his lordship's preferred distractions, a fresh edition of Horace's Odes, a decanter of Armagnac, and a brand-new Bach cantata on the gramophone. Yet despite every comfort, something about the affair continued to flicker behind his eyes, like a gas lamp not quite extinguished. He found himself, several days later, seated in a high-backed chair beneath the portrait of his great-aunt Honoria, who had once thrown a pince-nez at Disraeli, staring at the fire and tracing, with one idle finger, the spine of a slim, battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress, the first book on Miss Faversham's list. The books again, always the books. He rose suddenly and crossed the room to the writing desk, where he opened the drawer and took out the list she had left behind. 20 titles, each one dog-eared and deliberate. There was something hauntingly elegant about the gesture, like a dying detective scattering clues for an audience she would never see. Not for the police. Not even for him, really. For someone with the right kind of mind. Someone who still believed that a bookshelf could be an autobiography. He read the list aloud. The Pilgrim's Progress Jane Eyre Cranford, the mayor of Casterbridge Daniel de Ronda Bleak House, The Turn of the Screwvillette North, and South Green Mantle The Woman in White the Tragic, Muse the Scarlet Lettertess of the D'Urberville's Wuthering Heights Frankenstein, the Mystery of Edwin Droodfa. From the madding crowd Great Expectations, the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner. He sat back. There it was quite clearly now, a narrative arc. Not of murder or fraud or even retribution, but of identity. From innocence through romance, guilt, deception, hysteria, duality, despair. And finally, judgment. Private confession. Private confession. She had quite literally written herself backward. Like Elizabeth Carmody, like Edith Langley, like every woman in every novel who had ever turned her face from the light to see what waited behind her. He found himself smiling, not with pleasure, exactly, but with a reluctant admiration. Miss Faversham, who had been mocked by half the village for reading too many books and quoting Middlemarch at parish meetings, had given him one of the most elegant exits he had ever seen, a fiction written in fragments, a bibliography as a suicide note, a reverse narrative of self-reckoning. He returned the list to the desk drawer, locked it, and poured himself a second glass of Armagnac. Outside, frost had begun to knit itself along the corners of the library windows. He glanced up at the painting above the fireplace, Lord Mortimer Whimsy in hunting gear, eternal in oil and horsehair, and raised his glass in a silent toast. "To women," he murmured. who read too much and say too little. Bunter entered precisely as the clock chimed 10, and paused with the mild deference of a man who understood his employer's silences better than most. "Shall I prepare for the morning train, my lord?" "No," said Whimsy. "Cancel it. I think I shall stay a while longer. There are some books I've been meaning to reread." "Very good, my lord." As Bunter withdrew, Whimsy crossed once more to the library shelves. He reached for the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner, opened it to the first page, and smiled faintly at the inscription in faint pencil, M.F. Easter, 1911. Remember always to question the narrator. He sat down, book in hand, and began to read, not from the beginning, but 3 chapters from the end. Some stories, after all, are best understood backwards. In a room thick with the scent of legal dust and unseasoned wood polish, the trial of Elizabeth Carmody proceeded with all the solemn choreography of English justice. She stood in the dock, composed but diminished, dressed in the demure navy blue of someone attempting to impersonate contrition. The gallery was sparsely filled, 1 or 2 reporters, a representative from the Langley family estate who took notes with furious indignation, and Lord Peter Whimsy himself, seated with one knee crossed over the other, tapping a rhythm against the polished head of his cane. The Crown's case was, in terms of fraud, unassailable. Elizabeth's elaborate deception, assuming the identity of a dead girl to access an inheritance, was laid bare through documents, testimonies, and the cash retrieved from the station locker. Her handwritten annotations, the fabricated compositions and letters exchanged with the elusive Hubert Chance, painted the picture of a woman as calculating as she was clever. The case of Miss Muriel Faversham's death, however, proved more elusive. The court had the reconstructed timeline, the forged note, the vestry meeting, the lack of witnesses, the fatal fall. But the ambiguity of intention, did she push or merely watch, left the charge of manslaughter as a shadow rather than a certainty. Whimsy gave evidence quietly, clinically, declining to dramatize his deductions. He laid out the books, the encoded trail, and the psychology beneath it all. The judge listened intently, as Whimsy described how Miss Faversham, once the guardian of moral precision, had found herself mirrored and unmade by a more audacious pretender. She saw, Whimsy said, voice steady but grave, in the defendant, not just a fraud but a reflection. The danger of someone who lives entirely in performance is that eventually the stage collapses beneath them. Muriel Faversham did not die because she was deceived. She died because she saw the shape of her own doubts, and could not bear to let them harden into truth. When it was over, the court returned its verdict, guilty of fraud, perjury, and obstruction, but not guilty of manslaughter. The sentence was substantial. Elizabeth Carmody would serve time, though not perhaps as much as the newspapers had hoped. She left the courtroom with her head bowed, but Whimsy noted the curious detail that she did not look back. Hubert Chance, arrested too late to be of theatrical use at trial, pled guilty to conspiracy, and vanished into the penal system with barely a whisper. The Langley Trust was dissolved, the funds redirected by court order to a scholarship for young women in ethical journalism, a bitterly ironic compromise no one seemed entirely pleased with. Miss Faversham's funeral had taken place quietly and much hollering. Days after the inquest ruled her death accidental, but influenced by circumstantial coercion. The vicar's eulogy had been stiff, but the pews were full, and even Peggy the maid wept into a borrowed handkerchief. At the graveside, Whimsy had laid a single flower, Columbine, for folly, and said nothing. But it was not until several weeks later, seated once again in the rectory parlour, that Whimsy offered his final thoughts to Reverend Treadgold. "You know," he said, eyes half closed in the afternoon light, "what struck me most wasn't the brilliance of the fraud, but the vulnerability it exposed. Of Miss Faversham, of everyone, of systems built on trust, of intellect mistaken for wisdom, of people clinging to roles long after they've ceased to fit. The tragedy was not that she was fooled, but that she was almost complicit. She gave the girl the benefit of the doubt, not because she believed her, but because she wanted to believe in something bold, something unconfined. It was an act of hope, Treadgold, and it killed her." The rector stirred uncomfortably. "But surely hope is only admirable when placed in truth," Whimsy finished. Hope in a lie is not virtue. It is self-delusion. He stood, brushing crumbs from his jacket. Well, enough of that. The garden is looking absurdly hopeful itself. I may go and crush some daffodils under my boots. Therapeutic, don't you find? Outside, the spring had finally committed to blooming. The air was warmer, the trees knotted with buds, and birds, oblivious to questions of ethics and forgery, sang their oblivious chorales over the churchyard. Whimsy paused at the edge of the garden and looked back once, toward the cottage that had belonged to Miss Faversham. It now stood empty, shutters closed, the scent of lavender long faded. She had tried, in the end, to rewrite her story, and had died, quite literally in the margin. He tipped his hat to the still house, not in irony but in acknowledgement. Not all endings are just, not all truths lead to peace, but they must at the very least be told, and with that, Lord Peter Wimsey turned and walked away, leaving the garden, the governess and the ghost of a lie behind him, step by deliberate step, into the open prose of the world beyond.